They called it a handover, a ceremony, a transition. But the people who lived through it had another word for it: betrayal. 6 million people. 6 million human beings woke up one morning inside a British territory and went to bed that night inside something else entirely. And the worst part? Britain knew exactly what was coming. They knew for 14 years. And they said nothing. Not to the people, not to the families, not to the children sitting in classrooms learning about British law, British rights, British justice. Nothing. Hong Kong in the 1980s was one of the most extraordinary places on the face of the earth. A city built from almost nothing. A harbor city that had transformed itself into one of the wealthiest financial centers in the entire world. The people there were industrious, disciplined, brilliant. They had built skyscrapers where there were once fishing villages. They had created banks, universities, hospitals, courts of law. They had done everything a colonial subject was supposed to do. Integrated, contributed, thrived. They had trusted the system. And the system was about to walk out the door without looking back. Here is what most history books do not tell you. The negotiation that decided the fate of 6 million people happened in secret. No referendum. No public consultation. No vote. Margaret Thatcher flew to Beijing in 1982. She sat across from Chinese Communist Party officials, and she negotiated the future of 6 million British subjects, without asking a single one of them what they wanted. Think about that for a moment. She came back and called it a diplomatic triumph. She signed the Joint Declaration in 1984, and buried inside the fine print of that document was a clause that would haunt Hong Kong for decades. One country, two systems. 50 years of autonomy. Freedoms guaranteed. It sounded reassuring. It was designed to sound reassuring. But the people who wrote that document knew something the public did not. There was no enforcement mechanism. None. If China decided to ignore every promise in that document, there was nothing Britain could legally do about it. Nothing. The guarantee was written on paper. And paper burns. When the news reached the streets of Hong Kong, something shifted. You could feel it before people even spoke about it. The quiet changes. Families sitting around dinner tables with maps spread out in front of them. Fathers writing letters to relatives in Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom. Mothers queuing outside immigration offices before sunrise, clutching folders of documents. Children in school uniforms staring at world maps on classroom walls, trying to understand where they belonged. Because here is the question that nobody in the British government wanted to answer. If Hong Kong people were British subjects, why were they not being offered British citizenship? Why were 6 million people, people who carried British passports, who had served British institutions, who had built their entire lives inside a British territory, being told they could not simply come to Britain? The answer revealed everything. The British Nationality Act of 1981 had quietly reclassified Hong Kong residents. They were no longer full British citizens. They were British Dependent Territory citizens, a category invented specifically to exclude them. Invented specifically so that when the handover came, Britain would not be legally obligated to take them in. 6 million people, reclassified, quietly, with no announcement, no debate, no explanation. Just a piece of legislation slipped through Parliament while the public was looking elsewhere. And it went even deeper than that. Because inside Whitehall, inside those sealed rooms in the Foreign Office, officials had been running calculations for years. How many people would want to leave? How do we limit the numbers? How do we make the commitment sound meaningful without actually fulfilling it? The documents from those meetings exist. Some of them have been declassified. And what they reveal is not incompetence. It is not panic. It is strategy. Deliberate, cold, calculated strategy. Britain was managing an exit. And the exit had to be clean. No mass migration, no political embarrassment, no liability. The Foreign Office knew that once China took control, the legal framework protecting Hong Kong's freedoms would only hold as long as Beijing chose to honor it. They knew this in 1984. They knew it in 1989, when the world watched what happened in Tiananmen Square and Hong Kong streets flooded with 1 million people in mourning and in fury. 1 million people marching in a city of 6 million, demanding that Britain respond. Demanding protection, demanding that the guarantees mean something. And Britain's response? A limited right of abode scheme offering citizenship to 50,000 households. 50,000 out of 6 million, selected not by need, not by vulnerability, but by professional status and perceived usefulness to the British economy. The years between 1989 and 1997 were years of quiet exodus. Families who had savings left. Professionals with transferable skills left. Those who could not leave stayed. And they watched. They watched as British officials began the long, careful process of dismantling the colonial administration. They watched as Union Jacks came down. They watched as the last British governor, Chris Patten, arrived and made passionate speeches about democracy and rights that Britain had never actually bothered to introduce during 150 years of colonial rule. Because here is the bitter irony that nobody discusses. Britain did not give Hong Kong democracy while it had the power to do so. For 150 years of colonial rule, Hong Kong's governors were appointed, not elected. The legislature was controlled, not free. And then, in the final years, as the handover approached, Britain suddenly began talking about elections and civil liberties and democratic reform. Not because they believed in it, but because it created pressure on Beijing, because it made for better headlines, because it allowed Britain to perform concern for people they had already decided to leave behind. There were people who refused to accept this quietly. Activists in London, lawyers in Hong Kong, politicians who stood up in Parliament and said what many others were thinking but would not say aloud. That this was not a handover, that this was an abandonment, that Britain had made a promise to 6 million people and had engineered a legal framework specifically designed to avoid keeping it. They testified, they marched, they filed legal challenges, they gave interviews and wrote reports and demanded that the classified documents be released. Some of those documents eventually were released, and they confirmed what the activists had always said. The British government had known the risks, had known the limitations of the joint declaration, had known that without enforcement, the guarantee was hollow, and had proceeded anyway, because the alternative, taking responsibility for 6 million people, was politically inconvenient. On the 1st of July, 1997, the handover ceremony took place in the rain. British officers folded the Union Jack with military precision. Prince Charles read a speech. The last governor sailed away from the harbor on a royal yacht. And 6 million people stood on the shore of a city they had built with their own hands and watched the ships disappear into the dark. Today, the joint declaration that Britain and China signed in 1984 is described by Beijing as a historical document with no binding legal force. No binding legal force. The guarantee that 6 million people were told to trust. Gone. The freedoms that were promised for 50 years. Dismantled in under 30. The people who stayed are living through consequences that the architects of that deal knew were coming. And the documents that could tell the full story of what was known, when it was known, and what decisions were made behind closed doors. Some are still sealed, sitting in archive boxes in London, waiting. This is not ancient history. This happened in your lifetime, or your parents' lifetime, or your grandparents' lifetime. And the question that nobody in power has ever fully answered is this. If the deal was honorable, why was so much of it hidden? If the guarantee was real, why was there no mechanism to enforce it? And if Britain truly stood by the people of Hong Kong, why did they make it so difficult for those people to come home? These are not rhetorical questions. They are questions that deserve answers. Share this video, not because it is history, but because the people it happened to are still here, still waiting, still asking. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching this from? Because this story matters everywhere, and I need to know who is still paying attention.